Blueprints of Existence. A Digital Genesis. By Elton Gar. The end came swiftly with a runaway greenhouse effect, prompting an immediate transfer of human consciousness into a digital realm. The programmers had created the digital world, but had no time to put anything into it. So, Aaron's digital avatar was standing in an infinite white void. His body was in one of the underground caves, powered by the raging storms and heat on the surface, suspended and waiting for some time in the future when the world was healed. For now, Aaron tried to focus on his current situation rather than thinking about his family. In the vast white void, Aaron found only a computer terminal. That would give him access to the tools to shape his reality. Or at least that was the theory. But the only thing on the screen was a blinking line. There wasn't even a keyboard. Someone had made a mistake, and everyone was going to be trapped here, alone in this void forever. He almost walked away, but then remembered he wasn't here physically. He was a digital construct, and he needed to stop thinking about things the way he had before, so he touched the terminal. At first nothing happened, then words began to appear on the screen. They were mostly random, but he had nothing else to do, so he continued to practice controlling what appeared on the screen. Quickly, Aaron learned the commands to create basic shapes, spheres, polygons, cubes, giving the white void at least something for his mind to hold on to. For the first few days, he focused on turning the void into a world. The first plan was to recreate his family's house. He still didn't have color or texture, but he had time, and he could control the size of the objects. And working on the home allowed him to imagine the reunion with his family within these digital walls. Having a project helped him focus his attempts at making new things. And building things became much easier when he discovered the process of linking objects together and then creating clones of the new object. He was still limited to simple objects, but each day they were a bit less simple as he linked pieces together into more useful shapes. The next breakthrough was when he found a way to control the object's tags. Those tags let him control the texture, the weight, color, and the flexibility of an object. And he suspected much more as he searched for more tags. With that, he made his first useful object. Making a pillow seemed like it should be simple, but getting every value right was almost impossible, so he created dozens of pillows before he made one that felt good, and dozens more before it looked like he wanted. That was when he recognized the isolation was getting to him. He missed the everyday chaos of family life, the laughter, the arguments, the warmth. He even missed explaining that they were going to have to go into the void to his young children. The stark contrast of that to spending days adjusting the texture of a pillow only underscored the silence of his digital existence. So he moved on, this time working to create something far more complex. He expected that it would take months or years, but he was still learning, and he found shortcuts. The people who had programmed this place had wanted it to work, they had just lacked time. His hands shook as he finished his prototype. He expected it to fail. It really wasn't more than a few cubes and a lot of tags. But when he pushed the small cube at the front of the box, it hummed to life. The noise, like almost everything else, was unnecessary. He could have made a box with a bunch of tags, except that things seemed to work better for him when he could connect it in his mind to things in the physical world. After a few seconds, the screen showed a blinking cursor, just like the one on the terminal that had been here when he arrived. That wasn't all that useful on its own, but he was convinced that if he could connect to his terminal, then he might be able to connect to one in a different void. That shouldn't be difficult. They were supposed to be connected. Not every person in a single empty world, but every void connected into a single digital world, but something had failed. He hoped to fix that. There were a few problems. The biggest was that he had no way to control who he would connect to, so the connection would be random. There was also no way to know if someone else got his message. The best he came up with was to send a message to everyone. There was no broadcast function, but each terminal had a number, so by sending out the same message to each of those, he would, eventually, send a message to everyone. The message was short, but it included a copy of the schematics for the machine he had made and simple directions on how to create it. It also included his machine's number so they could send a message back to him. He had sent out enough emails to know it would take days before anyone responded. But within minutes the first message appeared. It simply read, "Have I finally gone mad?" While Aaron was answering that note, more began to appear. Each was similar in tone. They asked things like, "Are you real, and is this hell?" He almost immediately gave up on trying to answer them individually. He instead began to create a list of the numbers that had responded, and then sent that to everyone. That also became impossible within hours, as each of the terminals that someone else made using his instructions began to run the same program, including his terminal number, because it was an exact copy. Once that was done, he began to send out basic instructions on how to build things and how to share them. Then, exhausted, he fell into digital slumber. He had no good way to know how long he slept or what the sleep really was, but by the time he was awake, there were lists and categories of things. Most were cosmetic, but even those helped to connect to people. But the most important, at least to Aaron, were the updates to his terminal. There were thousands of people working together to improve it. Even some of those were cosmetic changes, but most were improvements on how they worked. He downloaded the forum feature that was being used by the people who were working on the improvements to collaborate, and immediately was tagged as user 001. He hadn't expected that, but he had become a bit of a hero. Not that it was a huge group of people. No one knew exactly how many people were connected, but the longest list they had was only about 10,000 people long. Almost as soon as he arrived, people began to post to him. The most interesting was someone who wrote, "We have a lot of people on the edge. I think it's vital that we work on a way to connect the voids and someone takes control. But I fear if we do it openly, it could make things worse." That was similar to what Aaron thought, though he wasn't convinced anyone needed to be in control since everyone had their own void and there was, so far as he knew, no way to hurt anyone, and with unlimited resources, there was very little reason for anyone to be in control. The terminals were a stopgap at best, but he couldn't be sure it was even possible to connect the voids. His fear was that the programmers had intended to finish the project, but ran out of time or something happened. There were still enough people not connected to start a war, and more than a few had suggested a nuclear winter might help cool things. The scientific consensus was that that was insane, but if people were willing to listen to scientists, then the void wouldn't have been necessary. Over the next weeks, they slowly gathered a half-dozen other people who showed enough understanding of the systems to be useful, and they worked together to create something that none of them could have done alone. Each of the 8 of them had created the same machine. Or more accurately, each loaded a copy of the same machine from the shared file. It appeared about 15 feet in front of the console, though scale was still hard to tell in the void, even with random things scattered about since most of those things could be of almost any size. It mostly looked like a long rectangle with a door at each end. The design was technically unnecessary, but the human mind still needed things to be ordered in specific ways. And this gave it a feeling of moving through a hall to another room, even if that room was an infinite void. There was some discussion about the dangers, but in the end, none of them cared, so user 8472, the first to suggest this plan, walked down that hall, and when he opened the door, Aaron was standing there waiting. This was the first meeting between digital minds, and Aaron put out his hand, uncertain if they could even touch. The man, who looked more like a mannequin than a human, took his hand in a firm grip and said,
"I'm Nolan. It is good to meet you. You look like you didn't finish the character creator."
Then I suspect we look identical. Another issue to work out. But at least we can do it together,
Aaron said. The others all wanted to visit as well, but they waited while Aaron and Nolan worked on clothing, something no one had considered until now because they were alone and had no real sense of temperature. They couldn't even make a mirror. They could come up with better solutions to altering their appearance later. But for now, they created a shirt and pants. Each person would simply pick a pair of colors that the others didn't use. They had assumed creating the device to connect the voids would be their biggest hurdle. But the real problem was scale. Every day, more people connected to the terminals. If they sent out the information for the gate the same way they had helped connect the terminals, they would have the same problem, except instead of getting more messages than Aaron could handle, he would get more people. And while they didn't require supplies, and the void was endless, he still didn't just want thousands of people standing around in his space. So Nolan convinced them that the bridges should be invite only. They could lock out any bridge, so they could invite someone, then lock them out if they were irrational. But even if someone was blocked, they could use their bridge to connect to others, so long as both sides agreed. That allowed Aaron to invite people while keeping his location private, at least for a while. It wasn't long before the rumors of being able to travel to other voids began to spread. And even with the precautions, Aaron's void slowly turned first into a town and eventually a city. At first, it seemed inconvenient having so many people around, but while it wasn't the same as his family, at least he wasn't alone. With time, the city became both more and less like the real world. People didn't need to follow the same rules, so technology exploded, and since anyone could have anything they wanted, most people spent their days playing games, sitting around and talking, and most importantly creating new things to improve the world. Art appeared everywhere. Buildings were changed to be more interesting to look at and more fun to live in. Even plants began to appear and reproduce themselves, turning into wild forests that people could explore. By the time animals had been crafted, people had largely stopped wanting to escape. But not wanting to escape into a half-dead world wasn't the same as being happy. The problem was that while there were now over 3 million people connected to them, that number was tiny compared to the amount of people who hadn't been connected. And since everyone they had found had been more or less at random, almost no one had found anyone who they were connected to before they had entered the digital world, and even those few who had found someone still were missing people. Aaron was one of them. He had always intended to spend his digital life with his wife and children. The children would have bothered him more, but they were sleeping. Even in the rush to get everyone digitized, it was clear that you couldn't allow children to be left alone even in the digital void, so they had been attached to the void, but never woken. There was a common conspiracy theory that they had never planned to wake anyone, or that they had decided to leave everyone in a void forever, but that only made sense if you also believed that the entire project was a way to depopulate the planet, and that was too far for most people, even if it had some truth. They really had needed to get the human population low enough that what was left could be supported by the badly damaged planet. But there were cheaper and easier ways to eliminate people. Besides, those people who were left behind weren't a ruling elite. Those had all entered into their own digital worlds. The people left were those willing to die to help the rest of the life on the planet have a fighting chance to survive. But his wife was likely out there along with a lot of other people living alone in a virtual sensory deprivation tank, with the only thing to do, try to understand a terminal that had no directions. So the expeditions began. He built a gate just like so many others, except it didn't need a second gate. With it, he could invade the void of other people. That was one of the few universally agreed upon crimes in a world where you couldn't hurt anyone, and theft was so pointless it never happened. That was why he went alone, with only Nolan knowing he had made the machine, and he had only told him because if he didn't return, he would be the most likely to continue the search for answers about where the other 6 billion people were. He half expected to die the first time he walked out of a doorway into a void that had not been connected to the rest. He even feared he might crash the program. Instead, he just found himself in nothing. It reminded him of just how bad those first few days had been. This had to be worse though, because he didn't even see a terminal like the one he had used to begin his process of creating a world. There was only a man standing silently. He didn't even respond at first. Then he flickered and began to move.
Where am I?
They asked in a voice that gave no hint of gender, age, or accent. That was another oddity of the digital world that they had been forced to fix, though Aaron hadn't been a part of that project. He had simply downloaded a voice and adjusted it until it felt like his.
We call it the digital void.
Aaron said.
I think they put me in a computer.
The other person said.
They put all of us in one. How long have you been here?
What do you mean? I just appeared here.
They said, and Aaron felt a weight fall off him. There had been some hope that the reason they had contacted so few people was that they were all in digital hibernation, but no one had told them that anyone but children would be unconscious.
It doesn't matter. Time doesn't have much meaning here anyway. But you should come with me.
The man fit into the city in Aaron's void well enough. Moving into a house that had been created by a collaboration of a number of people to be almost indistinguishable from a house in the physical world. It even had food in the pantry and running water. There were hundreds of copies of it, and hundreds of copies of houses that were nothing like houses in the real world, with impossible architecture and shifting rooms, all of them turning the once empty void into the biggest city in the digital world. But the man's appearance still caused the biggest rift in the growing society. One side was convinced that it was vital to keep people unconscious, trusting that the programmers had put them there for a good reason. Likely because too many people would overwhelm the computers and kill them all. The other group was convinced that because he had woken as soon as Aaron had arrived, that the programmers intended to wake up everyone, and that not doing so was practically like killing them. Aaron didn't know which side he fell on, so he did his best to stay out of the arguments. And that was all they were. Their bodies weren't really here, and since they had woken, no one had been, or could be, physically injured in any way, so the worst anyone could do to anyone else was call them names. At least that was what he had believed. But as the size of the society had grown, so had the factions, and there were always people who wanted power. What he hadn't expected was for the most powerful group to include the people he had been working with the closest. Nolan and the others who had built the first bridges had found a way to create a weapon that could put someone into the same suspended mental state that everyone else was in. It wasn't easy, but it used the same sleep function that many of them used to pretend they had real days here. A similar weapon could use the wake function, but since no one else knew how to make it, it was an effective weapon, and because it was non-lethal, there was no real deterrent to using it. Aaron saw the damage it could do almost immediately. Until now, the digital void had been a place of almost total personal freedom. But overnight that was gone. Anyone that the Cabal, as they had been nicknamed, disagreed with could simply be removed. That meant that quickly people fell in line or disappeared. Not all of them were attacked by the Cabal. Many small groups of people withdrew to other voids, and some cut bridges that led to Aaron's void to protect themselves. But something else happened. As people were put into suspended animation, their voids were returned to their empty state, and anything attached to their name on the system went inactive. Presumably to save space in the computer's memories. But it also meant that the people who had made the most useful objects were the safest to speak out, and chief among them was Aaron. Not only was the void where the most people lived his, but almost everything in it was based on his designs, including the consoles and the bridges. He did his best not to overuse that privilege because he feared that the Cabal had a plan. If it was him, he'd try to find a way to trap someone permanently in an empty void similar to the one they had arrived in, but unable to escape or create anything. It was much worse than simply putting someone to sleep, perhaps worse than killing them if you were alone. But the Cabal wouldn't act against him without good reason. There was too much risk. As one of the privileged, Aaron got access to the most advanced builds. He lived in luxury and had access to tastes and smells that the Cabal kept scarce for no reason but control, as there were no natural shortages in the void. Aaron watched in horror as people surrendered their freedoms over fears that were made up, and gave power to the real threat because they claimed to protect them. And slowly the correct choice became obvious. He hid his intentions as he prepared. Like so many things, he couldn't be sure it would work without testing it, but he wouldn't get a second chance. He considered trying to get access to the blueprints for the Cabal's weapon, but it was too risky. He instead made his own. It wasn't mobile like theirs, but it didn't need to be. Then once he was done, he stepped into the small box and turned it on. It wasn't as fast as he expected, but as Aaron shut down, he saw everything he had made and everything based on those designs disappear. That included the consoles, the gateways to other worlds, almost all the houses and adaptations to people, the weapons the Cabal used, and most importantly, the original terminal. He hadn't designed the original console, but just like in the voids he had visited, the console was connected to the person whose void it was in, and when he was disabled, so was the console. That left the Cabal trapped in his void with no way to make anything and no way to leave. As he fell unconscious, he hoped he had done the right thing. Aaron woke and felt the stiffness of his body. Across the room, a woman in a white dress turned and said,
"Another of them woke up."
What happened?
Aaron asked.
"You've been sleeping for almost 300 years. Don't try to move."
It only felt like a few years.
Aaron said.
"From our records, you were only aware for a few years, then shut yourself down. A bit odd, but better than the others. We had one group who spent almost the entire time locked into a void with almost nothing. They are beginning rehabilitation, but I'm not sure they'll ever be the same."
And my family?
Aaron asked.
"We'll wake them soon. We try to wake people in cohesive groups to make the transition easier. A lot has changed."
Is the world better?
"Than in your time?" "In many ways, but I assume you mean the environment. We have learned from the mistakes of the past, and it is mostly healed. Now it's about rebuilding what was lost and moving forward."
Aaron nodded, a mix of relief and anticipation building within him. The thought of seeing his wife and children again, of showing them this new and healed world, filled him with an overwhelming sense of purpose. After the years in digital isolation, the prospect of a real reunion was both exhilarating and daunting. But for now, he knew he had to recover, to rebuild his strength for the family reunion that awaited, and for the new life they would build together in this restored world. Author note:
I look forward to a post-scarcity world. I think we are closer to it than most people know. And I believe the biggest barrier to everyone having enough isn't the lack of resources, but a lack of empathy. Food is the most obvious. Every year, we produce more food than we need to feed everyone on the planet, and yet people go hungry so some people can have a bit more power over others, and more importantly, because the rest of us don't care enough to do anything about it. The same with housing, medicine, water, and almost everything else. It's not a production problem, it's a distribution issue. So in this story, I created a world where that became even more clear. Where people could have anything, but had that taken away, because if they had enough, they were harder to control. I hope you enjoyed it, even if I took a bit too long getting to the point. If you did, you can get free stories every week from my newsletter at www.scifi.com, or you can support me and get access to over 30 patron-exclusive short stories at patreon.com/Elton. Thank you. Elton Gar.